So we all have cells in the body. There could be cells that are found in the bloodstream. It could be cells that make up different organs. It could be cells that are going to be supporting certain organs. Each of these cells are susceptible to undergoing stress and undergoing injury. And it's either you adapt and survive, or you get injured and you die. Let's talk about cell injury. Grab a piece of paper and let's go. Hello and welcome to MK's Medical Review Series. My name is Dr. Moses Kazevu. This is a series on my YouTube channel that we look at medical topics in depth. Today we're going to be looking at cell injury, adaptations, and accumulations. This is going to be a 4-part video on the different aspects of cell injury, but in this particular lecture, I'm going to be looking at cell adaptations. In part 2 of these videos, I'm going to be looking at cell injury, talk about cell death, and then we'll end with intracellular accumulations. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell notification icon to be receiving notifications of such amazing content every time I post. Grab a piece of paper and let's go. So remember that the body is made up of organs, which make up organ systems. You have the respiratory system, the nervous system, the GIT, the GUT, the musculoskeletal system, the integumentary system. You have, of course, the skin. Each of these organ systems is made up of predominantly tissues. There are different types of tissues, connective tissue, for example. And each of these tissues is made up predominantly of cells. Each cell is made up of organelles. For each of these cells to work and to be functional, there has to be a constant adjustment in their structure, a constant adjustment in their function to meet or to create a balance between the demands as well as the supply, such that if these demands and there is excess stress, extracellular stress to this cell, it may lead to these cells actually being injured. Remember that cells are in a state that is known as homeostasis. This is a maintenance of a constant internal environment. So it means most parameters that are inside the body are supposed to be kept strictly within narrow ranges of physiological parameters. What do I mean? For example, the pH of the blood is supposed to be kept between 7.35 to 7.45. The concentration of sodium is supposed to be kept high in the extracellular fluid and low in the intracellular fluid. The concentration of potassium is supposed to be high in the intracellular fluid and low in the extracellular fluid. Temperature must be kept at a certain level. And whenever you have homeostasis coming out of balance, it means that cells are going to be injured. And remember that when the cells undergo this physiological stress, when they undergo pathological stimuli, they actually undergo adaptation that is going to be causing them to reach this new state where now there is this balance that is maintained such that they can keep their viability, they can keep their function. So we have a normal cell here that is in normal homeostasis, and this cell could be subjected to injury. When it's subjected to injury, two things could happen. It's either the cell is going to adapt, there are different adaptations, and this is what this lecture is going to be about, the different adaptations of the cells, or when it's subjected to injury, it could actually undergo cell injury. If it fails to adapt, it will invariably progress into the cell injury. But if it adapts and the stress is removed, it may revert back to being a normal cell. When you talk about cell injury, it could either be reversible, that's if the injurious stimulus was initially mild and transient, or it could be severe, and severe injury is going to be leading to this irreversible injury to the cells, and eventually it's going to lead to cell death. There are two different types of cell death that we'll talk about later on in the course of these videos. So you may have necrosis, which is, I like to think of it as genocide, where someone comes and shoots everyone and kills all the cells. Apoptosis, I like to think of it as suicide, where cells actually kill themselves. So it means that there are possibly three possibilities when cells are actually exposed to injurious stimulus. They could either adapt, or they may undergo reversible injury, and with reversible injury, they may revert back to normal if that stimulus have been removed, or they may progress to irreversible injury. Or sometimes, in some cases, if the injury is severe enough, it will progress to irreversible injury, and these cells are going to be dying either by apoptosis or by necrosis. So the principal adaptive responses that we'll talk about include hypertrophy, hyperplasia, atrophy, and metaplasia. Remember that if this injurious stimulus has exceeded the capacity of this cell to adapt, this cell is going to be injured. Or if this stimulus is inherently or is quite severe enough at the onset, the cell is actually going to be injured. But within certain limits, some injuries are actually going to be reversible, and once they have been removed, the cell can revert back to normal. But if they do persist, or they are severe, or they are rapid in onset, the cell will progress to developing irreversible injury. So remember that the cell adaptations are reversible changes that could affect the number, the size, the way the cells are looking like, the phenotype, the metabolic activity, even the function of the cell in response to this new environment that you have actually created. So like I said, the ones that we'll talk about are atrophy, hypertrophy, hyperplasia, dysplasia, metaplasia. So if you remove the stimulus that has been injuring this cell, it will go back to normal. So usually the adaptations are going to be resulting because there is persistent stress or there is persistent injury to these cells. And what you really need to note about these adaptations is that they could be physiological, meaning it's normal. When someone gets pregnant, their breast enlarge, their uterus enlarges because this is induced by hormones. So it's hormonal-induced enlargement. So this is a normal thing. It's a normal response. So we call this as physiological adaptation. Usually this is going to be in response to normal stimuli like hormones, even some endogenous chemical mediators. On the other flip side, you may have pathological adaptations where now there's just this stress that's not supposed to be there, and these cells are actually changing to modulate their structure, to modulate their function, such that they become resistant to being injured. So there are different types of these. So each of these cell adaptations actually has a physiological types and it has pathological types. So we'll begin with the very first one, which is atrophy. So remember that atrophy is where you have a decrease in the size of the cell. So remember here, the cells don't die. Please pay attention. The cells will not die. They don't die. So it's just the size that has decreased. And the size of the cell decreases because the cell actually loses its substance. So when you have a lot of these cells actually decreasing in size, essentially the size of the organ or the size of the tissue is also going to decrease. Like I said, I'll keep emphasizing the cells are not dead. They are just much smaller than they normally are. As you can see in this picture, you have a normal cell and you have cells that are atrophied. Remember that after atrophy, you're going to reach a new state where now there's a balance between the cell size, which is much smaller and needs much less blood supply, much less nutrition, much less trophic stimulation than a cell which is a normal shaped cell. And each of these can either be physiological or it could be pathological. And the cells that are going to be, or tissues that are going to be susceptible to this atrophy are going to be things like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, secondary sex organs, and even the brain. What you've noticed about some of these organs is that they consist of cells which are terminally differentiated cells. So I'll just take a step back. So when you look at cells, you have predominantly three types of cells. You have cells that are known as continuous dividers. These are constantly in the cell cycle. These are going to be cells like cells of the skin, cells of the GIT. Then you have what are known as facultative dividers, which are cells that have the ability to enter in the cell cycle once they are injured. Best example I can give you are cells of the liver. The third type are the terminally differentiated cells, which have finished, they do not even divide, they've reached their potential, such that if you injure these cells, they're going to be replaced with scar tissue. They won't be replaced with other cells that look like them. So under the light microscopy, when you see this atrophied tissue, they're going to be shrunken and they'll have this lipofuscin granules in their cytoplasm. So what are some of the causes of atrophy? They could be physiological causes, for example, aging, senile atrophy or involution. It could even be happening with the thymus. Remember, the thymus is where you train those lymphocytes. Once it has served its function, it involutes and it becomes atrophic. You may have loss of endocrine stimulation. For example, after menopause, the breasts are going to be changing. The size of the uterus also pretty much it will not be, or the endometrium is pretty much not going to be functional. Then you have pathologic causes of atrophy. For example, if you injure yourself, you have a fracture and you are immobilized for some time. Remember, the body doesn't keep sustaining what it doesn't need. So if there's a decrease in workload, if you're not using that muscle, it will shrink. It will decrease in size. Sometimes it happens with denervation of certain organs. Once you cut out that nerve supply, they also begin to atrophy. A decrease in blood supply, which could happen in atherosclerosis, inadequate nutrition like marasmus, even pressure to certain organs or certain tissues. This is very common, especially with tumors. For example, if you have a tumor that is in the pancreas, that tumor could actually compress on the pancreatic normal tissue and can actually affect the normal pancreatic tissue. So how does atrophy actually happen? So remember that in atrophy, there's going to be a decrease in protein synthesis. There's going to be an increase in the proteins that are being broken down. So you're doing this because metabolism has reduced. So you can't keep making the same proteins that you were making because metabolism has reduced. How does the cell actually do this? It actually, there's a protein that's known as ubiquitin. So there's a ubiquitin proteasome pathway. So all the proteins that are meant to be broken down are going to be tagged with a protein that's known as ubiquitin. So once now that ubiquitin is tagged to this protein, it means these proteins are destined to be broken down and are going to be broken down by the proteasome. And once they're broken down to amino acids, these amino acids could be recycled for something else. This is what we actually see, especially in people that lose significant amount of weight, especially with cancers. We call this as cachexia. So this pathway is what is thought to be responsible for this, where you have a lot of this ubiquitin, which is going to be tagged to certain proteins and attach these ubiquitin to these cellular proteins via the enzyme ubiquitin ligase. And then these proteins are then going to be destined to be broken down. So in most of the instances, atrophy is actually going to be accompanied by increase in autophagy, which is cell eating. It eats itself. And then it's going to be resulting increase in the number of autophagic vacuoles as well as lipofuscin granules. The next cell adaptation is hypertrophy. So this is like the striking opposite of atrophy. So here the cells are going to be increasing in size because you're increasing the synthesis of these intracellular components. If you go to the gym right now and you start lifting heavy metals, your muscles are going to increase in size because you're putting them under stress. Then hypertrophy is going to be involving an increase in the intracellular proteins rather than increase in the fluid that is present inside the cell. So it's different from hyperplasia. When you talk about hyperplasia, this is an increase in the number. It's not increase in the size. Here you have the same number of cells. It's just that the size is the one that has increased. But of course, both of these can happen at the same time. So you could have certain organs that are hypertrophying and also undergoing hyperplasia. So hyperplasia is usually seen in those cells that are capable of replication, like I told you, those cells that are going to be either the facultative dividers or cells that are going to be continuous dividers. The ones that are terminally differentiated cells, these ones are not going to be capable of undergoing hyperplasia. They're only going to be capable of undergoing hypertrophy. And remember that hyperplasia and hypertrophy, like I said, is going to happen at the same time. Eventually, if you have a lot of these cells that are hypertrophied, it will increase the size of the organ. So in pure hypertrophy, there are no new cells. The cells are just bigger than they are because they have more structural proteins, they have more organelles, instead of them having larger cytosol, as some of you would think. So here's the difference. So here there are 4 cells here. Here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cells. So there are more cells here, and the cells are appearing bigger. So there's hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Here, there's just pure hypertrophy. They're just increasing in the size. So remember that hypertrophy also could be physiological or pathological. So physiological example that I can give you is, of course, what is happening inside the uterus when someone is pregnant because of the stimulation of estrogen. So remember that the smooth muscle is going to be stimulated to hypertrophy and undergo hyperplasia, and then this will cause enlargement of the uterus. And it's also seen when you go to the gym and start lifting muscles, they're lifting weights rather, your muscles will hypertrophy, they will appear bigger. Then in terms of pathologic hypertrophy, best example I can give you is in the heart. When the heart is put under a lot of pressure, for example, in hypertension, in those people that have aortic valve disease, there's a lot of tension that is put across the wall of the myocardium. Those myocardial cells will enlarge. But eventually, remember that if this isn't removed, they'll begin to atrophy. If they go beyond their physiological limit, the muscles will atrophy and the heart will now what we call undergo cardiac dilatation. It's what we call cardiac dilatation. So hypertrophy is seen most likely in heart, skeletal, cardiac, as well as in the kidneys. Remember that hypertrophy has a limit. So like I said, beyond this limit, the heart will no longer compensate. Those cells will no longer compensate. And if the stress is still present, then there will be some degenerative changes, like I told you, ventricular dilatation, that we see in a condition that's known as heart failure. In terms of hyperplasia, this is just simply they're increasing in number. So because there's a lot of mitosis that is happening in the tissues, a lot of mitosis that is happening in the organs. So this one usually takes place in those cells that are capable of replicating, dividing. So it's either happening in the terminally differentiated cell, in the facultative dividers, or it's happening in those cells which are going to be continuous dividers. Now, it doesn't happen in terminally differentiated cells because those are incapable of undergoing hyperplasia. So it means that it's going to be cells that are like the nerve, the cardiac, chondrocytes, osteocytes, skeletal muscles are going to be incapable, I don't think incapable exists, incapable of carrying out hyperplasia. Then hyperplasia is commonly going to be seen in cells like the epidermis, cells of the intestines, cells of the liver, which are the hepatocytes, the cells of the bone marrow, even the fibroblasts. And remember, this can occur together with hypertrophy in response to the same stimuli. And just like the other adaptive mechanisms, they could also be physiologic or pathologic. Example of physiologic hyperplasia could be subdivided into two types. Could be due to hormones, which we call hormonal hyperplasia, which I've already talked about when I was discussing hypertrophy. For example, the effect of estrogen on the cells of the uterus. They begin to increase in size, they also increase in number. And also the proliferation of the glandular epithelium in the breast tissue, which is in response to progesterone if you're talking about the lobules, and estrogen if you're talking about the ducts. It may also happen in the bone marrow, someone who's living at high altitude where there is less oxygen tension, less oxygen partial pressure, so there's a lot of erythropoietin that is released, so the bone marrow may undergo erythroid bone marrow hyperplasia. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you could have compensatory hyperplasia, which is going to be helping with tissue and organ regeneration. Here, it's quite common in cells of the epidermis, cells of the intestines, cells of the liver, the bone marrow, and even the fibroblast. You could actually grow certain organs just from a small piece of an organ. You get a small piece of the liver, you can actually grow a liver from that. So the residual tissue is the one that's going to be growing that part that has been lost. And this is what helps us to do with these liver transplants. And the mitotic activity is going to be in the remaining cells that are there in that particular organ. It can be as early as 12 hours after you implant it or after the injury has happened. It continues to restore itself, and the liver can actually even restore its normal weight. Then the stimuli for this hyperplasia is thought to be due to these polypeptide growth factors that are going to be produced by the cells which are uninjured, and as well as the non-parenchymal cells. So after the cell has restored itself, there are certain turn-offs that are going to be produced to inhibit the growth. Because remember, if this continues, if hyperplasia continues, it may create a problem. It may be pushing us towards cancers. Then in terms of pathological hyperplasia, this again is most commonly due to excessive hormonal or even growth factor stimulation. Best example I can give you is, remember, after the normal menstrual period, there's going to be a burst of uterine proliferation that is going to be regulated quite closely by these pituitary hormones, and as well as the ovarian estrogen, and it's going to be inhibited through progesterone. But there is normally a balance between the estrogen and progesterone, and if this balance is disturbed, this will mean that the endometrium will become unstable. The endometrium can thicken. This person can undergo endometrial hyperplasia, and this is actually what's going to be commonly causing people to have this abnormal menstrual bleeding. Remember that the hyperplasia is an important response to connective tissue and wound healing, but sometimes if it happens too much, you may actually form this hypertrophic scars. then again, it's also going to be essential because the fibroblasts in the same wounds, the blood vessels in the same wounds are going to be essential to help in repair of this particular wound. And in the process, these growth factors that are going to be produced by the white blood cells are going to be causing this to happen, and this would be in a response to the injury by the cells, and also produced by cells that are there in the extracellular matrix. Remember that these growth factors that are involved in hyperplasia sometimes can actually even be involved with certain viral infections, especially with papilloma viruses. Remember that not all human papilloma viruses can cause cancer. There are some that are benign, quote unquote, and they're going to be causing these skin warts from happening. They're going to be causing these mucosal lesions happening, and here the growth factors may actually lead to maybe encoded by the viral genes or the genes of the infected host cell by that virus. Remember that hyperplasia is going to be mediated by these growth factors, the cytokines, trophic stimuli. It could be increased expression of growth-promoting genes, which are known as proto-oncogenes, increased DNA synthesis, as well as cell division. Remember that this process must be controlled, and these signals must work hand in hand with each other. The signals that stimulate hyperplasia and the signals that stop hyperplasia must work hand in hand, such that these cells must always be responsible to the normal regulatory control mechanisms, because immediately if it stops being responsible or stops being responsive to these normal stop regulatory mechanisms, then this is what is going to lead to cancer. So in most of the cases, pathologic hyperplasia is going to be a fertile soil for cancers to actually arise. For example, if you have a patient that has hyperplasia of the endometrium, they're at risk of developing endometrial cancer. Then metaplasia is this reversible change in one adult cell type or one epithelium or mesenchymal cell being replaced by another adult type. Now, here a lot of people tend to actually confuse this a bit. Now, metaplasia doesn't mean the cells that are already there are the ones that are changing. No, it's the stem cells that are being reprogrammed to make different type of cells than what they normally make. So remember that a stem cell is a cell that is capable of creating different types of cell lineages while it's maintaining its own population. So what we think metaplasia is you have reprogramming of those stem cells that are going to be now differentiating into a new pathway rather than what is already supposed to be there. And remember that the cell type that is sensitive to whatever injurious stimulus, whatever stress has been there, is going to be replaced with another one that is much more resilient to the injurious stimulus. But of course, this also comes with problems because that cell is not supposed to be normally there. So some examples that are there, for example, inside the bronchioles, in people that smoke cigarettes, remember that cigarette smoke has a lot of these noxious chemicals, a lot of these toxic things that can irritate the epithelium. So instead of having the normal epithelium, remember that the normal epithelium in the bronchial cells or in the bronchi is going to be that mucus secreting ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It has one layer. That's a pseudostratified columnar. Now it's going to be changed to something that has many layers to prevent that irritation from the mucus and that damage from the cigarette smoke, toxins, and those chemicals. Now it's going to be changed to another epithelium that's known as a non-ciliated stratified squamous epithelium, and this one doesn't have goblet cells. It's a good thing that you have many cell layers and the stem cells are being protected. But remember, you've gotten now rid of the cilia, you've gotten rid of the goblet cells. So you can't really make mucus to trap all the dust and everything. The cilia can't beat to move that mucus. So these patients now are going to develop this chronic cough, which is known as the smoker's cough. So sometimes the influence that's going to be inducing metaplasia change, if it persists, it can actually predispose them to malignancy. Remember, metaplasia is not malignancy, but if we leave it to continue, it may predispose a patient to developing malignancy. For example, squamous metaplasia of the respiratory epithelium can actually coexist with lung cancers composed of these malignant squamous cells. Vitamin A is actually essential for the normal epithelial differentiation, so some people have thought that deficiency of this vitamin can actually induce the squamous metaplasia, especially in the respiratory epithelium. Another type of metaplasia could happen, what we see in the esophagus. So remember that the esophagus is going to be connected to the stomach, and there's a sphincter there that's known as the lower esophageal sphincter. So sometimes there could be some acid that is refluxing from the stomach getting into the esophagus, irritating the esophagus. This can cause the cells of the esophagus to actually change. So the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium is now going to change to what is known as an intestinal type or a gastric type of columnar epithelium. We refer to this as Barrett's esophagus. So this, remember, has these goblet cells, or it has sort of like some protection against the acid. But then again, if this persists, it can predispose a patient to progressing to adenocarcinoma. So here's a picture of what is happening. So as you can see here, you have the normal columnar epithelium over there, and as you can see here, the cells are now beginning to differentiate into something else, are beginning to differentiate into this stratified squamous epithelium. Or rather, they're coming from the stratified squamous epithelium and differentiating into the columnar epithelium, And remember that this columnar epithelium is a single layer, and unlike the stratified squamous epithelium that is multiple layers, this is what is seen during metaplasia. So metaplasia can also occur in these mesenchymal cells, and sometimes it's a reaction to some pathological alteration, and not really an adaptive response to stress. For example, in the bone, it can occur to actually soft tissue that can form at a site of injury, and some bone material can actually even deposit in fibrous tissue. We call that as osseous metaplasia. It can also happen in the other cells other organs that are responsible for making red blood cells, like for example the spleen and the liver. We call this as myeloid metaplasia, or this extramedullary hematopoiesis, where red blood cells are being synthesized from a place outside the bone marrow. Remember, I will keep stressing this: metaplasia is not cancer. Metaplasia is not cancer. Then dysplasia, which is not really a typical type of adaptive mechanism. Here, there's abnormal proliferation of cells such that there's a change in the cell size, a change in the shape, a loss of cell organization. And remember, dysplasia, again, also is not cancer, but it may progress to cancer. So you may think of it as a pre-neoplastic lesion. It's not really considered as a true adaptation, but we rather think of it as a type of atypical hyperplasia, where some cells are distorted in size, some cells are distorted in shape, and they even lose their organization. Tissues that are prone to dysplasia are the cervix. For example, you may have cervical intraepithelial neoplasms, which is just this dysplasia affecting the layers of the cervix. You may sometimes have respiratory epithelium that's being affected, and these are strongly associated with development of cancers in these areas. Remember, even though dysplasia is reversible, if the stimulus persists, it's invariably going to lead to this person developing a carcinoma, this person developing a cancer. In terms of aplasia, which is failure of the cell to be produced, this usually happens during the fetal development. Remember, aplasia is going to be resulting in agenesis. Sometimes organs fail to form, and later on in life, it can actually be caused by permanent loss of precursor cells in the proliferative tissues, for example, in the bone marrow. I really hope you enjoyed this video on cell adaptations. If you did, consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the bell notification icon so you never miss on such amazing content every time I post. To Zambia and beyond, my name is Dr. Moses Kazevu. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, bye-bye.